Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, hello and welcome. We're so excited to have everyone here today. Um, of course, today we'll be talking about how to build and scale a drone program at your company. This could be of interest if you have a smaller operation or you might work at a really big company. Either way, if you're trying to figure out how to actually get a drone program up and running at your company, you're in the right place. That's what we'll be covering today. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that this is a difficult time for all of us throughout the world right now. We are thinking of those who are suffering, and we're grateful for those who are doing essential work right now. So we just want to acknowledge that. It's certainly a strange time that we're all living through. That being said, we're grateful to everyone who's on this webinar right now for taking the time to join us. I promise you, you're going to get some really valuable information today. We have some excellent speakers lined up for you, and we're excited to share from their experience building and scaling drone programs in their organizations. So my name is Zach Dukowitz. I'll be your host today. I'm the content marketing manager here at Flyability. Our two presenters are two people who have real in-depth experience building and scaling drone programs. Calvin Rieb is the lead of global unmanned systems at Cargill. Cargill is a massive company. I'll talk a little more about them when I introduce Calvin here in a moment. And James Manny will be talking today as well on how to scale a drone program. He's the UAS program manager at the Tennessee Valley Authority, also called TVA. A few housekeeping items before we get started. So the first one, this is really important. We can't unfortunately have everyone with live mics today. We can't have you asking questions live because we have hundreds of people on the webinar, but we do really want to hear from you. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So to do that, please use the questions pane. You'll see this on your dashboard. All you have to do is click the caret and it will open this drop down, and you simply type in your question, and we'll be answering questions live to the best of our ability. And when I say live, I mean we'll be typing in answers in answer to your questions. Some of your questions we'll be curating and we'll be using for a live Q&A here at the end of the webinar. So please, throughout the webinar, don't be shy. Get in there, ask questions. We really want to hear from you. We want to provide as much value as we can today. So please don't hesitate to ask us questions using that chat pane. Or I should say questions pane. Sorry, there is also a chat pane. You can use that too. Really use either one. So just to give you a sense of how the time will be spent today, we're starting off with a 5-minute introduction. That's what I'm doing right now. We'll hear from Calvin for 20 minutes on how to build a drone program. Then we'll hear from James on scaling a drone program. And then we've allotted 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So again, there is a big emphasis on the interactive Q&A session because we really want everyone who comes to get their questions answered. So if there's something that you want to know about building or scaling a drone program, it could be that you already have a drone program, but you've had trouble growing it within your organization. One thing we hear about a lot is people who have trouble advocating internally. You know that a drone is a useful tool and that it can help with safety, ROI, and lots of other benefits, but it's hard to sell that idea internally. So that's something we want to hear about. If that's a challenge that you're facing, you might have a really specific challenge related to inspections. Whatever it is, we'd like to hear, and we'll do our very best to answer your questions. So our first speaker today, Calvin Rieb, is the lead, again, of global unmanned systems at Cargill. And I mentioned a moment before, Cargill is a massive company. They have 160,000 employees in 70 countries throughout the world. So you can only imagine when it comes to standing up a drone program, it's going to be complicated, right? But Calvin is the guy for the job. He has a lot of experience with systems and creating complex programs. He brings to his job at Cargill experience as a graduate of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He's also a certified project management professional. He spent over 18 years working in aviation with the Department of Defense and in the commercial sector. Calvin's also helped large companies to get Part 135 certification. He can't say exactly which companies, but there's only 2 that actually have it. If you guys want to look it up, it's a pretty impressive list. Part 135, if you haven't heard, is the certification required right now from the FAA to be a drone delivery company, to be a drone airline, essentially. So Calvin has a lot of experience working in the drone industry. So we're really excited to hear from him. In his current role, he oversees Cargill's drone program, of course, where he works supporting internal adoption, also managing risks associated with operating drones. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Calvin.
All right, sounds great, Zach. Get my screen up here in a second. And everybody, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. I greatly appreciate Flyability actually taking the time to organize such an event. I think it's of great value to the industry as well as those operators that are out there. So get my screen going here and we'll start off. I do want to provide one note. I always have a bad habit of adding additional content into my slides. So I did validate with the folks Flyability. You will have the ability to actually get a copy of the slides via download. So no need to take copious amounts of notes. All right. And Zach, if you'll just confirm that I'm presenting, I'll keep trucking on.
You're good to go. Thanks,
okay.
Calvin.
So topics of discussion, I just want to give you a quick overview of Cargill ecosystem that I created a few years ago since I was playing whack-a-mole. Show you our approach to drones and kind of our thought process for managing them. Look at how to kind of get things started on an execution standpoint, and then also look at how you would want to create some charters to actually create projects and initiatives and kind of get to that point that Zach was alluding to, which is trying to get organizational buy-in. So Cargill at a glance, like Zach mentioned, really big company and very diverse company. We actually have, own 2 chocolate manufacturing companies, and then also own salt mines and have metals and grains and meats. And so you're talking about a very industry-rich environment for the use of drones. The complexity really comes around the fact that we operate in 70 countries and working with all the different civil aviation authorities, but we won't waste our time here talking about that. On the unmanned systems ecosystem, so when I first got into helping organizations, what I started to find was that we'd bounce around back and forth between talking about hardware, talking about flight systems, talking about how we're going to train the remote pilots, how we're going to manage remote pilot licenses and IT infrastructure regulations. Sort of coming up with this pictorial design, and I think it's of great value because this really is kind of the centric behind understanding a drone program. I've talked at a lot of other industry events and said, some of the OEMs have done a really good job of helping foster the growth of unmanned systems within organizations, and others I feel like at times have kind of done a disservice. And the disservice part of it comes from this notion that you go buy a system, you throw it in the organization, and that's it. It's just that simple. And we all know that it's, for most of us on this call, it's not that simple. There's a lot of different components and processes that go into it. So then we have to think about how do we tackle, this big challenge of managing the operations, meeting regulatory requirements, establishing great IT infrastructure so that the data is getting from the payload itself to the end customer, and potentially even furthermore to other customers within your organization that can benefit from that data. And you'd be surprised on how many people can actually access and use that data and find ways to promote it. And then you have little things like, it's not little, but I call them little things like hardware and software that are out there as well. So when we talk about the approach to the overall aspect of drones, the first thing that comes to mind for everybody most likely is the risk component, and then also the management component. So what I found is that there really is 3 main kind of functional groups within big corporate companies that end up owning this technology. They own the risk, and that's typically the corporate aircraft team, if you have corporate aircraft within your organization, the IT team, or its own service delivery team. My thoughts on that is I lean toward the corporate aviation side just because they're the ones most versed in the Civil Aviation Authority regulations, and they understand the complexities behind that. Then you also have the need and necessity to tie in your internal function teams. And I think that's probably one of the most understated or least thought of component when building a drone program. Because drones actually are going to touch numerous facets within your organization that are out there today, right? So we all know you have to have insurance, liability insurance. If you're hiring suppliers, you want them to have insurance. We talked about the IT component. That's important to tie them on that. They may have solutions that you never thought of, or there may be existing solutions that already work. Legal, lots obviously legal aspects. EHS is another component. You have your security team potentially. So not only are these folks going to help you with your program, they could potentially be customers of yours and using the drones later on, for example, insurance. So they may help you on the front of creating and establishing what is that minimum liability policy for your service suppliers, but also in turn, they may want to use the drones to actually conduct or validate and submit insurance claims. We also have the necessity, as always, to develop corporate governance and ensure compliance with applicable laws, create standardized processes and procedures. Again, another target-rich environment within this industry. The manufacturers have done what they could with providing checklists, but those checklists are typically very scarce when you compare them to things like the manned aviation world. Education and educating leadership and providing awareness. There is a lot of information out there today. So I think if you are a program lead or you're in management within the role of drones within a company, small or big, it really is your onus to make sure that accurate information is being presented to leadership and individuals within the organization so that they understand the true benefits, and then also just constantly refreshing them, since this is a very evolving and fragile industry with whether it's regulatory or technology. Communication training is extremely important in my mind when you're talking about getting the actual remote pilots operating, as well as spending some time training management or those folks that are going to be hiring service providers. It's going to be crucial so they understand what does a ideal and safe operation look like versus one that's not. Data management, can't harp enough on that as well. That's a very critical component. We were actually chatting a little bit prior to this call about data management, and I don't think anybody's quite found the silver bullet there. Everybody's still kind of hodgepodge and trying to figure out how to make that work, but that's also a huge necessity. And then lastly, if you do have a safety program, which I recommend for everybody and is a requirement, once you start getting into BLOS as well as 135 ops, really follow that SMS methodology. And IKO is the one who has really created that fundamental Bible, and then it's been distilled down into the different industries. So the FAA has their version of what SMS looks like. And I'm not saying that you need to implement a full SMS program, just stating that you really need to, at the end of the day, follow those principles. So obviously with any organizational approach, you're going to want to have some goals and missions. Here at Cargill, what we've done is we've prioritized those and kind of outlined 3 of them. And then we've outlined how we want to use the drones within the organization, since there are so many requests. So first and foremost, our CEO has his own goals, and we align those with ours. So number 1 is obeying the law. Number 2 is using drones in a very safe manner so we don't create accidents. And then the third is let's figure out a way to use drones to be competitive in our environment and within our industries. When we talk about prioritizing drones as far as using them within the organization, there's some similar alignments, and you'll see that first and foremost, we want to use drones to reduce risk so that we can preserve life and prevent injury. Second is looking at cost savings, efficiency gains, and better decision-making, better situational awareness, and then creating precise data, digital libraries for our assets. So a little sample of an organizational chart. I thought this would be beneficial and helpful to those folks out there. I know I've had a lot of questions about, hey, how does an organizational chart look like for drones? So this is pretty straightforward. The functional groups that you see above where it says Cargill Business End Users is really that team that's tied into us within our drone program. And it's great because we have a dotted line over to them to say, hey, we have a legal question. Hey, we have an insurance question. Hey, we have a global security question. So working in a company with 160,000 employees, it's really important to have that actual individual run to. When you look at internal operations, I think this is a big question mark, and a lot of people are kind of sorting their way through. For us, we have the ability today to have a very small corporate service model where we go on site and actually conduct the work. We also have conversations within certain BUs or geographical sites that are going to be setting up their own service-based delivery. And then we have a handful of site-specific operated drones that are basically servicing that locale geographical locations. So that model, really bounces around within the different organizations. And then lastly, we rely on our external vendors or external suppliers to come in and conduct work as well. An ideal, perfect world, and in a world that drones were doing everything that the organization wanted and needed, it was creating absolute positive ROIs. It was paying for itself. I would say that this org chart is what I call level 3 would be the most ideal. Having an identified safety manager, having an identified training manager, a fleet manager, and an IT manager. Obviously, all reporting back to the lead. You'd obviously have a chief UAS pilot that could bounce around and do some proficiency and currency checks or training on more advanced technologies. And then you have your suppliers or vendors, and again, being supported by those various functions. So not only is it crucial to establish that particular framework to get some support, because you typically on an island when you're managing a drone program within a company, you kind of need to find what are those capabilities and responsibilities, because you'll end up getting signed up for things that you didn't know, or you'll have folks within your organization that potentially may run down the lane of capturing some of these capabilities and responsibilities that they may not be the best suited for. So this is a quick example. High level, the green blocks basically say, we're responsible for policy and practices, education, training, safety, delivery, operations, UAS systems, and then data. And then underneath that, you have the different subsets. So governance, as a prime example, here at Cargill, we've really followed the manned aviation methodology, knowing that we operate in so many different countries, and certain CAs have very robust and rigid rules and regulations. So what we have here in this essence is a general operations manual, an SMS manual, contractor compliance manual, vendor vetting policy and procedure manual, ERP, and then our latest manual that we're working on is the UAS IT manual, which is going to be a conglomerate of saying everything from our retention of management to how does an actual drone pilot take the data from the drone and then input it into our internal systems, and then how is that data cataloged and shared and potentially protected, and all those facets, as well as touching on some topics around certifying actual drones and software with use within Cargill, since there are so many conversations that are existing out there in that realm for certain OEMs. So when we talk about starting points for a drone program, if you're in the early stages of really getting a drone program going, what I would say is I bet that you've already had drones used within the organization. I would take a look at, how effective were they used? Did they work really well? Did they not work well? What are challenges and problems that can be tackled? There's nothing better than having an amazing success story by using a drone to solve an organizational challenge or problem that's existed for a decade or so forth, or maybe you have assets that have never been inspected. Defining goals and forecasting demand timelines are important, and I won't cover all of these, but most importantly, I would say is that number 2 is use the drone to solve a challenge or problem in the organization if you're not already, because it will get visibility, and it's kind of that ignition point to get the program running. When you're looking at starting projects for the use of drones within the organization, here's kind of a quick brief charter. Again, data-rich slide here. Didn't mean to make it that data-heavy, but again, you'll have copies of these slides. Really, the takeaway here is have a plan. Make sure that you're educating those folks that are going to be looking at using the technology. Provide pathways for them to understand it. Provide them options, as well as capture those ROIs. I think one of the biggest failures that I've seen in the past few years is folks go out and they conduct the work, they get that report, they do the volumetric survey, they do the asset survey, they do the GIS survey of the land, but they had plenty of time that day to go use drones somewhere else to also look at how drones could benefit the organization. But then in the end, even though they go and conduct all that work, they don't go quantify out the ROIs and say, yeah, today we probably reduced hazardous work hours by 20 hours. We probably saved the organization this amount of money. Make sure you're capturing those and tying those to the report, because those data points, after a 6-month or a year period, are going to be very telling. So when we talk about ROIs, again, try to speed up. You don't have a ton of time, but again, we went the extra mile to say we need to define our ROIs. We have qualitative and quantitative ROIs. The ones, again, you'll see that are most important to us are reducing hazardous work hours and then the cost saving side of it. So within our organization, this is within a very small B through a project that let's find ways we can use drones within your BU to save time, money, and reduce hazardous work hours. Again, some of these are really straightforward and low-hanging fruit. Others are a little bit more complex. But again, this is an example of the necessity of working with the different folks in your organization and identifying those. Here's some examples within our organization of work that we've actually conducted and some metrics. Big takeaway here is, obviously looking at cost savings and increasing safety margins. A lot of these, terms everybody's familiar with. One of the ones that kind of pops out at me that I always think is interesting is we use drones in South America for security operations. And it's not so much to increase our security posture, but to actually reduce our hazardous work to our security guards because of the actual venomous spiders and bugs, and then the potential carnivore animals like tigers and lions and so forth over in Africa and some of our other plants. So it's always interesting to see how you can insert some additional data points for ROIs. Here's a rough example of a business analysis case that we always conduct here. So we always do give the suppliers an opportunity to bid on our jobs where we can, and then we assess, what does the BU want to do or that organization want to do, and then we assess the technology costs, and then we also judge out the ROIs. So in this instance, it makes sense to buy the technology, train the two folks. If they're going to continue to use this technology and use it in a repeatable fashion, here we're saving on not having to pay for scaffolding by $20,000, and then we're reducing our downtime by 3 to 5 days. So when you talk about reducing downtime, again, another area to look at is if it's an asset that's producing a product, look at the throughput that you're going to be increasing if you're reducing that. So in one of our sites, it's literally, we were going to be creating $200,000 worth of more product on an average year over year. And then final thoughts, again, sorry, it's kind of like a lightning round here, but just understand that the reason why there's the need for the microscope or the heavy processes within drones, and it may seem arduous, is because we are in a highly regulated environment. And I think that environment continues to evolve and become more challenging. So we have the CAAs like the Federal Aviation Administration in the US for Transport Canada and Canada. We have the federal government, state, and local entities. And the local entities are really becoming kind of the bird in my side, I would guess you would say. And I've seen where HOAs now are talking about trying to restrict the use of drones within their communities. So it's challenging to keep up with the laws and rules. But my advice to everybody out there is if you're doing the right thing and you have a lot of supporting documentation and processes and can show whoever that is that says you violated the rule or regulation, the likelihood of you really getting violated is going to be slim, in my opinion. If you're following, again, the SMS principles, you have documentation, you have a training program, so on and so forth. The last thing you want to do, obviously, is cause an accident and then be in violation of the rules and regulations. Again, lean on your internal teams. Make sure that you're managing data and cybersecurity appropriately. Work with manufacturers. I think manufacturers are becoming more and more of a great source of information and wealth. I know I've had a lot of great conversations with Flyability. They're definitely committed to their customer base. Can't say that for all drone manufacturers that are out there, but Flyability is one of the great folks to work with. Demonstrate ROIs. Again, cannot repeat that more and more. Maintain metrics. Lean on colleagues. I do work with, and give colleagues calls, whether it's in the utility industry or other sectors of the ag industry, and say, hey, what is this? Does this sound right to you guys? Have you vetted this technology? Have you not vetted this technology? I think there's a wealth of knowledge. I think these seminars are a great opportunity as well. So, if you guys have some great ideas, I would say reach out to Flyability if you can jump on here as well. Tackle low-hanging fruit first. Don't burn yourself by trying to create a BLOS system. I think that's important as well, because drones have a lot of opportunities on the low-hanging fruit side. And then lastly, do help the drone industry by providing factual data, share success stories, be involved with your CAA, and honestly promote fair and balanced regulations that are going to allow us to support growth. Don't try to box other folks in at the end of the day. So that's all I have. I apologize for going over about 3 or 4 minutes, Zach.
No, you're just fine, Calvin. We really appreciate everything that you just shared and the thoroughness of the information that you shared. I think a lot of us on this webinar are probably taking copious notes right now. And I do want everyone to know, we'll cover this again at the end, but there will be a recording going out. So if you're worried that you missed something that Calvin shared or that James is about to share, we will be sending out a recording. So have no fear. There was just a ton of useful information in those slides, so you will get the chance to look back over them later. And now I'm really excited to introduce James Manny. So James is the UAS program manager at the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is also called the TVA commonly. So the TVA provides electricity for 10 million people in different parts of seven southeastern United States, or U.S. states, excuse me. So it's also a massive organization where, again, standing up and scaling a drone program has a lot of potential challenges. James has been involved in the commercial aviation industry since 2012. He's been working with drones for the last 5 years. In 2018, James joined the TVA with the goal of integrating new technology into TVA's enterprise system, and he's the one who stood up the drone program at TVA last year in 2019. So today, James is going to be talking about the different ways that drones are being used to support inspections in power generation, as well as how he helped build and also how he helped scale the drone program at the TVA. So James, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zach. All righty. Zach, are you seeing what I'm seeing, sir?
Yep. Yeah, you're good to go. You're perfect.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you. Well, welcome, everybody. Appreciate you having the time to be on the call today. So as Zach alluded, I'm James Manny, UAS Program Manager from Tennessee Valley Authority. We are a federal corporation serving 10 million people. We're a bit of an oddball. So we are a utility. We make power. We move power through our transmission system, and we manage the Tennessee River system. But because we are federally linked, we also have energy, which we touched on, environment, and economic development stewardship that we are also charged with keeping track of. So a bit of an oddball in the utility industry, but it allows us to help our community and help our portion of the country just that little bit more. So in the past 18 months, TVA went from not having a drone program at all to establishing an internal department. We went from 2 drones that were a part of our integration program to 35. We've got 26 licensed, trained pilots in our network, and we feel very strongly that we've allowed work to be conducted in a safer manner and in a more efficient manner as well. So we had very humble beginnings in 2014, 2015, when commercial drone technology started to become more reliable and more usable. We had folks out in the field recognize that, bought equipment, but didn't necessarily execute the grand vision effectively. And we had some incidents, and TVA leadership decided to place a moratorium, an executive ban on drone technology. So we were not coming into this project in a position of strength, needless to say. So a big part of our integration and scaling has been working with our continuous improvement group here at TVA, and we decided to run this project on a big team, small team line of thinking. So we had a 3-person integration group that did the majority of the research, the benchmarking with the utility industry, with the UAS industry, with the aviation industry. How are other companies of TVA size having success? How can we implement that success at TVA? And that 3-person group took all the information and presented it to the business unit working teams. So we identified which groups would have an interest in this technology, whether it be on the power generation side, the transmission side, our security team, IT, cybersecurity. So we identified the useful and necessary team members and presented them the information. And we also had that larger team get creative. How do you want to take this technology and use it in your business unit? And our ethos for the teams was to be open, be flexible, and be creative. I think that's the last one especially. Be creative has been a huge key in scaling our program. And then we jumped into phases. So phase 2, process map. internal policy and procedure development, standard operating procedures. We were able to take our knowledge as aviators. I have an aviation background. This project was stood up inside of our corporate aviation group. And much like Calvin and Cargill stated, there's an inherent benefit to having that safety culture built in. Folks are going to know how to follow a process, how to follow checklists, and keep safety as the primary goal moving forward. Phase 3, we implemented a testing program. We bought a couple of aircraft. We tested the use cases that we had benchmarked against and what our business unit partners had come up with, and started to develop the program. And then the last phase is department implementation. So process map, not very exciting, but it was really important for us to answer the question of how do we go from someone identifying a need, I need a drone to do this job, and how do we flow them through a controlled process so there's a maximum level of awareness, there's a maximum level of safety to them actually executing a flight and using the data. So I had to do a little bit of paperwork and whatnot to get to this point, but very important to understand what our standardized processes were going to look like. Then we went into flight testing. It was an 8-month period, and this is just some of the examples of the different activities that we did. So every business unit that was a part of our working team, we made sure to set aside time to go test with them. Is this going to work? What are the proof of concepts? What are the challenges that we're going to encounter operating in TVA's environment? Because flying it inside of a power plant or out on the transmission system is not a simple task. So it was very helpful for us to identify easy wins and identify some of the shortcomings that either the technology that we were using had or our process had. Because not everything is going to be a win. The drone is certainly not a cure for cancer. It's a collection tool. It's an inspection tool. So there are environments it doesn't make sense in, and it was important to identify those as well, because scaling the program with wins is a lot easier than scaling a program with explanations of why something failed. So something to keep in mind. And then the department execution. So after our 8-month process of testing use cases and developing a training program and identifying industry partners, we were able to present our findings to leadership, who funded a department. They signed off on all of our processes and procedures, and we were allowed to begin the hiring process of a 4-person team. So the structure of our program is a self-dispatch model. We've got 3 operational tiers, with tier 1 being our cross-trained employees. So for TVA, those are AUO, assistant unit operators at plants, engineers, security. TVA has a federal law enforcement agency, TVA Police. So we definitely wanted to get the technology in the hands of those folks. Linemen, TVA covers 86,000 square miles of territory, and it's unrealistic to expect a 4-person team to cover all of the needs that our service territory requires. So getting the technology out was very important to us, but it also meant we needed to have a robust training program. Early on, we went back and forth about farming out training versus doing it ourselves, and considering our unique environment, we decided to benchmark and implement our own training program. And in 7 months, we were able to train 22 pilots, and hopefully when things begin to return to normal, we'll continue with that, and it's been very successful. Tier 2, this is our aviation services group, our UAS operations and training group that exists inside of our aviation services organization. And this is all of the complex flights, or what we consider complex. So your LiDAR sensors, your multispectral sensors, large drones over 10 pounds, indoor flights, flights that require FAA waivers. All of that is performed by our staff. And then tier 3 is our approved contractors, and we have a list of requirements for those folks. And you'd be surprised, even some basic requests such as do you have a standard operating procedures? We were amazed how many approved contractors or highly regarded contractors, at least at the outset of our program, couldn't answer basic safety questions. So definitely want to make sure those folks are vetted as well. And then here's some of the use cases that we tested and are doing on a routine basis. And to me, it really gets back to that be creative ethos. Not everything sounds like a good idea at first. I never would have imagined flying drones inside of an irradiated power plant, but when you realize the return on investment and the safety savings, time working in a confined space, time working under a radiation work plan, that's where we see huge buy-in from our nuclear partners, and that's true across any of our generation. Once folks see the benefits firsthand, and that's part of the reason we put the picture in there of the TV setup. We're always trying to sell ourselves, and whether that's hands-on or allowing people to see an operation in progress, it goes a long way in getting leadership buy-in. Same thing, we manage the Tennessee River. We have 29 power-producing dams. This is a 350-foot long penstock or water intake system that somebody has to climb up and inspect on a periodic basis. And we're able to reduce the cost spent putting them there. We're able to reduce the risk involved, and it's been a hugely beneficial project for us. We've still got 6 coal plants in our fleet. They're old, they're legacy assets at this point. Many of them are over half a century, and they need to be taken care of to remain effective. And then again, in the mindset of power generation, combined cycle and simple cycle of combustion turbine plants, everything is an asset that has a level of risk associated with it. We're able to prevent a lot of dangerous inspection work using a piece of technology that can be replaced. People cannot be replaced, but a drone certainly can be. So as we look forward, transferring data into usable information, that's a big piece for the entire industry. How are we going to take the data that we've collected, integrate it into our existing workflows and asset management tools to turn it into usable information? And that's a big initiative at TBA. We still plan on training an additional 30 pilots this year. We're going to continue that next year. That self-dispatch model is very important to us. And then our continued advancement of sensors and applications, as well as aircraft and the holy grail of outdoor operations beyond line of sight. So closing thoughts, my advice to scaling a program really stems back to creativity, communication. The drones collect really cool information. They sell themselves in a lot of ways, and easily accessible wins are excellent communication pieces for leadership. We've allowed our folks to get hands-on time. TVA has 2 creative showcases each year for groups to first showcase technology and then second showcase their processes or their return on investment. And we're very excited to be a part of those, and we plan on being a part in the future, and that really allows folks from all across our organization to get a hands-on experience with what we do and how we're effective. So with that in mind, Flyability will certainly provide a copy of our information, and that's how we've scaled our program and continue to have success. So.
Great. Thanks so much, James. We really appreciate everything that you just shared with us. So we're going to move on to our Q&A here in just a moment. Before we do that, I wanted to just call out a few things. The first thing I've already mentioned, but it's worth saying again, James just alluded to this as well. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar after the webinar, so please look for that coming in your inbox. And then one other thing we want to mention, today's webinar is part of an ongoing series of webinars that we're hosting at Flyability. These are keynote talks that we had originally planned to do live at our user conference, which was scheduled for March in Denver, Colorado, where we just opened our first US office. Of course, due to the ongoing pandemic, it was not possible to have the user conference. But we've brought the content to you guys in these webinars. So we're really excited to still be able to share all this valuable content with everyone. So we've already done 3 webinars. Today's the 4th that we've done. The 3 that we've done are on the screen. One was about inspection standards from API and ASME experts related to drones, what they look like now, what they're going to look like. The second one was the way that country of origin drone bans might impact US companies, with a special emphasis on public safety agencies. The 3rd webinar we did was yesterday. It was on 3D modeling with indoor drones. Obviously, today's webinar is on building a drone program. Next week, we have a webinar on drones in oil and gas from expert speakers at Chevron. And also next week, we have a webinar on specific use cases for indoor 3D modeling, where we'll walk through with folks who actually do indoor 3D modeling on a regular basis, where they use it, how they use it. So it'll be really getting into the weeds with indoor 3D modeling. We have a lot of other webinars coming up, so you can see updates on the link that's on the screen. That's all as far as upcoming items. So now we'll dive into the Q&A. So one thing I want to call out going into the Q&A, you'll see on the screen right now the emails for different contacts at Flyability. So if you have a question for Calvin or James, please feel free to reach out to them. If you have a question about the Helios 2 or the Helios 1, or you want to learn more about Flyability's indoor drones and how they might be useful for your organization, please reach out to Alex or Johan. Those are the 2 emails that appear at the bottom of the screen. We certainly want to be in touch, and we see today's webinar really as the beginning of a dialogue. So we're looking forward to these future conversations. So all that being said, let's dive into questions. So the first question I think will be of interest for both James and Calvin. And this is a question I think it's really common when you're considering building a drone program. How do you make the decision between using a drone service provider or internalizing your drone program? How do you decide, do you do one or the other? I think some folks do a little bit of both. So how did you guys navigate that decision making? And maybe we'll start with Calvin and then pass it to James in the same order that we presented.
Okay, yeah, so on our front, what we've done is, we obviously look at availability of people within the organization that can conduct that work, the timeline, that's the necessity of getting that work completed, that's a variable. The other probably more important variable for us was, and still continues to this date, is the type of technology going to be used. So, for example, if it's some LiDAR work, we're going to rely on suppliers. We currently don't want to invest in LiDAR technology. So there's more high-end complex missions. We may rely on service suppliers. Overall, big picture, what we found is that operating internally for a lot of our sites seems to be the best approach, because we have the ability to expand and educate and train those folks on site. One of our challenges, though, is that we do have sites that have no interest in operating drones. So that kind of defaults back to using a service supplier or using your own internal service team that you have within your company.
Yeah, so we evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. It depends on what the job is, if we have those capabilities in hand. I think most of the contracted work that is still conducted are large-scale operations that we don't have any experience in, or we don't have the sensors in-house. So as our program has grown, a lot of the contracted work has fallen off because it's more cost-effective for us to do it in-house. We've proven with our return on investment and the added flexibility. So it's easier for us to do, especially for nuclear sites and different generation sites. It's much easier for us to gain access to those areas than it is bringing in a contractor who has to go through several additional training sets. So all in all, case-by-case basis, and it largely depends on what the requesting business unit is asking for.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And thank you both, James and Calvin, for those answers. We do appreciate it. James, we have a question from Dan who's asking, if you could do it all over again, what would you change, if anything?
We had to do it all over again. Looking back, I think our project ran very effectively. So there's not a whole lot we would change. I think the biggest piece would be on the data management side. I think we could have communicated to the rest of TVA the challenges that were going to be involved with managing terabytes of data and then tying them into the workflows. A lot of times, let's say an engineer requests a data set from a third-party vendor. That's a nice turnkey solution where we have to bridge that middle gap between the collection and the end user. That's definitely a challenge at TVA, and it's still unclear who is responsible for that. Is it us, the folks who gather the data? Is it the person who uses the data? Is it our IT department? So I think if we did it all over again, more emphasis on how we're going to manage the data, I think would be something we would want to do again.
I think that's a really valuable insight from that something you may not be able to anticipate out of the gate unless you're talking to someone like you who's already been there. And actually, I know Dan was addressing the question just to you, James, but I think Calvin, I'm sure you have things that you might have learned or that you might change too. I'm wondering what you would say to the same question, and I'm wondering if what James is saying about data resonates. I know you mentioned data toward the end of your presentation as well. Is there anything, Calvin, that you'd change if you could do it all over again?
Yeah, so ours is kind of the opposite. It's kind of funny. We got hung up in trying to find a bunch of solutions and building this huge concrete framework that was going to be our true foundation of everything going forward. And I feel like we spent a little bit too much time on that. That may be partially my fault on my own because I'm just heavy in documentation development, process development, and so forth. We obviously have a lot of stuff working in parallel around the world. But in hindsight, I think what would be great is to get some OEMs in the door, do proof of concepts a lot earlier, get those individual sites exposure to the technology. I think that's one of our challenges still today, is providing exposure to the different folks in our organization. But yeah, I mean, obviously you have to build a process and you have to build systems, but you don't need to build the BMW or the Bentley of the system. I know Bentley is a software solution, I mean, use their name, but just use as an analogy, build something like the Honda Civic that's going to get you down the road and get the end-to-end connected, and then just work on that, day after day. Don't go out and try and build Rome in one day.
That's helpful. It's interesting to hear both of your perspectives coming in some ways from different ends of the data side. A lot of these questions, I really think both of you guys have really, valuable information to share. So this question was originally asked by Orlin to Calvin, but I think I'm going to ask Calvin you to answer, and James, if you can also piggyback on what Calvin has to say. So the question for Calvin was, how large currently is your fleet of drones, and what type of drones are in that fleet?
Yes, a great question. So we have stuff around the world. We're talking about like 20-ish drones within the organization that operate around the world, primarily DJI type products, just because of the ease of use. We also have, in one way, it's good for us that we don't only operate in the United States. So DJI, is not necessarily as much of a concern as there continues to be out there in the market. But that's our primary operating systems is the DJI systems, whether it's the Mavic or the Inspire. They're all smaller systems at this point. We have some fixed wing systems for our palm plantations in Indonesia, but again, tackling the low hanging fruit right now, and then going to build and get some bigger systems.
Excellent. And James, can you speak to that too? How big is your fleet, and what types of drones you're currently using?
Yeah, currently we've got 35 FAA registered aircraft in our fleet. We have maybe about 15 more on top of that. So let's call it even 50 in our fleet. Most of the tier one work, in fact, all of the tier one work is done with commercial off-the-shelf DJI products. Almost everyone's using the Mavic 2 because it works. Indoors, we've got 3 different OEMs that we use. We also have some in-house designed indoor and outdoor aircraft for experimental purposes. But mostly a DJI shop. with a mixed indoor use at this point.
Cool. Thank you. So question for you, James, from Suraj. The question is about ROI. Suraj says drones can be very expensive to purchase and maintain. So what do the economics look like? What's the ROI on the expense that you might make? And again, I think Calvin can speak to this too, but we'll start with James. Like, yeah, what's your, when you crunch those numbers, how much, I know you've mentioned savings, how much are you saving and what does it look like from a, bird's eye view?
ROI is important, and it's been a bit of a challenge. Not every use case that we use has a slam dunk, easy to quantify number associated with it. So the ROI that we look for, number one, is safety. Are we reducing hazardous work hours? That's the first thing that we look at. Number two, are we collecting better data or previously inaccessible data about our assets? Third is efficiency. So it ties back into work hours, and can quantify a number from that. And then last is cost saving. So it requires a good deal of effort to capture those ROIs, especially on complex projects. There's a lot that gets asked of the requester on an ROI type investigation, but it's, as Calvin said in his presentation, the earlier you can track that and have that information easily available offhand, the better you're going to be. So for us, it really takes having several conversations with the requesting business unit to figure out that ROI. But even though it can be frustrating at times, it's worth the effort put in to have that information available.
Awesome. Thanks, James. And Calvin, can you speak a little to the ROI question too?
Yeah, sure. So, there's different baselines you can use when you're establishing the ROIs. I think that, obviously using a service supplier is a great opportunity to come forward and say, let's do some proof of concept testing, or we're not going to invest a bunch of money in this, we're just going to test it out. And then from there you can analyze, if we bought our own drones, we trained our people, and we manage this program, how can we, basically exploit that across the organization and then get those multipliers and say, okay, well, clearly we're going to have an ROI. So I think it's examining, what is the service supplier going to charge you to conduct the work, or what are your legacy current processes and procedures costing you today to conduct the inspections? In some instances, again, there's some high costs, and I think that's a struggle for some organizations, is getting with accounting and saying, how much was your maintenance budget last year? How much was that spent on inspections? How many of those inspections could have been conducted with drones internally or externally? And then from there, you start getting those qualifiers. I would say just make sure you're looking at all that. That's on cost savings. The ROI on hazardous work hours, that can be challenging to build the business case. But just do due diligence, and I think that you'll find if you can extrapolate and exploit that technology across the organization, that's where you really get your large ROIs. It may not be that one individual site.
Thanks so much. And thanks to you both. Interesting to hear your different perspectives. And I appreciate James pointing out that whether or not you can always make a strong business case, removing people from harm's way is a valuable goal in and of itself, even if the ROI isn't always quite there. And Calvin, I know you'd feel the same. And also, Calvin, I appreciate you kind of highlighting how sometimes you have to dig a little deeper and look at assumed costs, right? If you budget every year for inspections, you may just see that as a line item instead of thinking of it as something that could be reduced. And so, one thing we talk a lot about at Flyability is the cost of simply building the scaffolding to support an indoor inspection in a boiler or a pressure vessel. And if you remove that cost of scaffolding needed and the downtime associated with putting up and taking down the scaffolding, that alone can seriously impact the ROI on general inspections. Question about, sorry.
Yeah, question, Zach. Are you able to, I know we're running quickly on time, but do you have the ability to share my screen really quickly? And I could walk somebody through really fast how to do a, just how you could consider doing an analysis for looking at data.
Yeah, give me just one moment.
Yeah, so I'll just share this really quickly.
There we go. I think I just handed it over to you. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, is there a spreadsheet there in front of you?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, so like here's a quick example of how we look at things. So we look at the forecasted benefits and gains. In this instance, we're using drones for security. So we look at, what are we paying for ground vehicle expenses and how can we reduce the use of those? Same thing with reducing potentially a whole security guard post or a security guard contractor. Then you look at your startup cost of the drones, you have all your ancillary equipment, and then you start looking at annual recurring costs, right? So that's going to be challenging to figure out maintenance, the support equipment, but you can kind of do a rough estimate, and then you start looking at 1, 2, and 3 year savings. So when you start multiplying out not only at multiple sites but multiple years, again, those ROIs, those cash flows, yeah, I mean, like you're hitting hurdle rates depending on what your hurdle rate is. In this instance, you're getting 135% IRR on this particular return. So just some simple math and getting simple numbers, you'll find that, in my opinion, you can quickly scale the program and pay for itself overall. So.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Calvin. That's awesome, and I'm sure people are appreciative. Just with your transparency. So another sort of related point on ROI, right, is a drone might be a relatively big upfront expense, especially a professional drone made for certain types of jobs, but it's a one-time expense as opposed to a recurring expense you might have for personnel, for building scaffolding, and those expenses that are recurring, the line item might be smaller than the one-time purchase of the drone, but over time you'll get these exponential returns, or not exponential, but you'll get these accumulated returns, right? So as we saw in your spreadsheet, which is awesome. Let's see, so we're going to continue the Q&A a little past the half hour. We completely understand if people need to hop, but there's a ton of questions, so we do want to try to answer questions, and we want to try to provide that value that you guys came here for. So if you need to go, we totally understand, but if you'd like to hang out, we'll just spend about 5 more minutes answering questions. So a question for both of you related to compliance, and this might be especially interesting for you, Calvin, because you're operating so many countries, but the question is, this is from Patrick, what kind of compliance issues have either of you faced in indoor environments, and how have you gotten over those compliance issues, related to regulations and also to inspection standards? So wondering if you run into either of those issues in indoor environments specifically. And James, let's start with you, please.
Sure. So the major compliance piece that we've run into is radio frequency interference inside of the nuclear plants. And fortunately, TVA already has a system in place for testing those. And then all the equipment we use has FCC registration numbers associated with it. So we're able to quickly quell those fears, number one. And then to the quality of the inspection or inspecting to a certain standard, we've had to certify certain processes and the cameras that we use to different levels. So the big one is ASME, visual acuity testing. We went through a whole round of that with our inspection group, and the different aircraft that we use are rated for different types of inspections. So some of the work orders or some of the jobs that we're asked to do don't require any standard, but for those that do, we had to go through the process to certify the aircraft and then the way we collect the data. So something to think about. Not every site requires that, but for those that do, certainly something that had to be addressed at TVA.
Really appreciate that, James, and it's just always valuable to hear from direct experience, right? So thank you. And Calvin, could you speak to the compliance question about indoor missions?
Yes, so the fascinating part of that is that the FAA has no purview of indoor flights, right? So you're inside. So I think that's an interesting component. And then you got to ask the question, do you require your suppliers and do you require your internal team to get Part 107 licenses? And our answer is, yeah, we do. That's just the best practice. But the other component is just like James alluded to. It's probably on the compliance side is making sure that inspection is going to meet the criteria and satisfy the actual inspection itself. So going forward in building maintenance procedures, testing those procedures, and then looking at change management and saying, okay, we're instituting, implementing this new tool, new asset. We may be collecting more data than we've ever collected before. How do we handle that data as far as area of interest, and then qualifying to say, is this going to create a work order to actually, conduct work or not conduct work? So I think that's the big piece in compliance, is just, internally validating that this method of doing the inspection is proven, and getting that completed, and then there's the FAA component as well.
Thanks so much. And so this is a question about the pilots that you guys use. And Calvin, you already mentioned Part 107, and James, I think you guys I'm sure you're on board with that too. We're in the U.S. The question about pilots, though, are your team of pilots all full-time? Do they have other duties? Are they part-time? What does that look like when you have an internal team of drone pilots? What is their actual role, and are they filling several roles? Sometimes do they wear several hats? And Calvin, let's start with you, and then take it to James.
Okay, yeah. So right now we don't really we have basically myself as the full-time guy internally. Everything else it's an ancillary duty to them. So we have project engineers that are also UAS pilots. We have agronomists that are UAS pilots. We have plantation workers that are drone pilots. So we don't have any primary today. The way it's structured, and it's evolving as we speak. But today, basically, it's an ancillary or secondary duty to individuals.
Got it. And James, what does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, so the Tier 1 section of our UAS program is split duty. They have a first hat, a first job that they perform, and the drone is a tool to help with that job. But throughout our integration process, we felt like we came across enough useful use cases and potential benefits that it warranted having an internal full-time group as well. So we have 4 people on our UAS operations team. A big part of that is the training of the Tier 1 folks. We wanted to train them in-house on our system with our complex environments and what have you. So that's certainly a big role that the full-time folks perform as well. And then also when you get above 10 or 15 pounds, it's a different level of operation than flying a Mavic. And we didn't feel like we had safety in the best, safety was not paramount if we're going to give someone who flies a drone maybe once a month, an M600 or something that's going to be, 20 or 30 or 40 pounds. So a lot of that was driven by our use cases, and that's why we kind of have a split approach.
That makes sense. Thanks so much, James. And I forgot to mention that last question came from Mark. So thanks, Mark, for the question. And so I'm going to just ask you guys a pretty simple question, and we'll close things out. John's asking whether you use off-the-shelf fleet management and flight software like Skyward or Kitty Hawk, or if you have something that's custom built, or maybe some combination of the two. So yeah, James, I'm curious if you can answer, and then we'll pass it to Calvin.
Yeah, so we do have off-the-shelf flight management or fleet management software. We have integrated it into a couple of our systems. The software we use has open APIs that we're able to tie in to what we have here at TVA. But that as we went from 2 drones and have scaled since then, it really helps keep track of the aircraft and all associated components, and then the pilot information. So all of the 107 info, the contact information, our operations manuals, our checklists, all of that lives in paper form, but inherently it's in our fleet management, which has really been a big part of our program and helping keep things organized.
Yep, and then on our front, we do some off-the-shelf solution, and then we also have some internal solutions that we developed in SharePoint. So, what's unique to Cargill is that, again, operating in so many countries, we have numerous languages. So, and with drones are very fascinating. They're not like an aviation, asset like an aircraft where ICAO says you have to read and write English. So we also have that challenge. We have yet to find a solution that would fit our needs of kind of managing our global operations. So we have a combination of the two.
Got it. Great. Thank you both. Well, do you guys have time for one more question? I know we're well over the half hour. If you need to run, We understand.
Sure. Good. Good to go for a few more minutes.
This will be the last one. So we've touched on drone training, training your pilots. James was speaking about this a moment ago. This last question is from, I'm going to butcher the name, but Young, who's asking whether you have any tips for training your pilots within organizations, whether there's any problem areas to look out for, any pitfalls that you've seen come up in drone training internally. So maybe Calvin, start with you, pass it to James, and that'll be our last question for today.
Okay, yeah, we have a pretty straightforward system. Again, we globally, it's different requirements and rules and so forth. So, what we do require is we have an internal online safety ground school course that we use as our baseline for everybody to go through, and then we put the onus on them to study and take the actual test for that particular country's CAA rules and regulations. As far as challenges, I would say one of the bigger challenges is just you have a fleet management tool, you can obviously maintain records, and when that 2 years is coming up for the FAA. But I would say one of our challenges right now, or weaknesses or opportunities, is make sure that you at the program level are providing recurrent training and also being proactive with them so that they're staying on top of the rules and regulations. So when the 2 years comes up, they don't have any problem taking that test. And maybe it's not so much reaching out as having resources or an ability for them to study with some kind of a company-wide solution for them to use overall.
Awesome. Thanks, Calvin. And James, can you speak to drone training as well?
Sure. No, I think Calvin hit the nail on the head. We have everyone. We're based in the U.S., so we have everyone come in at a baseline of the 107 certificate. That's a requirement to get into our training class, and then providing the resources for folks to stay up to date and being there for support if they have questions is a huge piece of the training. And then for us, identifying a safe environment to train folks who are going to be flying in a dangerous environment. I mean, our guys get right up to 500,000 volt power lines. They're in a plant operating environment. So identifying a space that we could train to that level of effectiveness without putting them or an asset at risk was a big piece. And we were fortunate to identify something that we already had that could fulfill that role as a training ground. But all in all, training to your specific challenges. If training was easy, that's not really going to help. It's got to be challenging and it has to be lifelike. So those are things that we felt were very important coming in.
Wonderful. Thank you both so very much. I know everyone who attended, I think, got a lot out of both of your presentations. And I'll say, as someone who's moderated a few of these webinars recently, this is the most engaged I've seen an audience. These are the most questions and the most really useful, valuable questions that we've seen. So we're grateful to both of you for presenting. We're also really grateful to everyone who came today for showing up, for being engaged, for asking your questions. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Thanks, Calvin. Thanks, James. We really appreciate you guys. Stay safe out there, everyone. That's going to be it for today. We will be in touch with a recording of this webinar via email, so look for that. And take care.
And thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.